In 2011, a scanner in Texas turned on, and a Mastodon rib that had sat in storage for 30 years lit up from the inside. There was something buried in the bone, not a crack, not a natural spur, a point, sharpened, made of bone itself, and the rib was roughly 13,800 years old. That's older than the first Americans were ever supposed to exist. Someone had hunted this animal with a weapon on a continent where humans weren't allowed to be yet. The man who dug it out had been called reckless for decades. He was about to stop being the joke. Let me show you exactly what that scan revealed, because it's stranger than a date. The object is a spear point, but it wasn't carved from stone. It was shaped from the bone of a mastodon, possibly the same kind of animal it ended up inside. The tip had punched into the rib and lodged there. And here's the detail that changes everything. The bone had started to heal around it. The animal was struck, and it lived. For a while, at least. That's not a fossil that fell into a hole. That's a hunt. A hand drove that point into a living animal roughly 13,800 years ago in what is now Washington State. Now hold on to why that number is a problem. For most of the 20th century, the story was locked. The first people to reach the Americas were the Clovis, named for their beautiful fluted stone spear points, first found near Clovis, New Mexico. They crossed from Siberia, walked south through an ice-free corridor, and arrived around 13,000 years ago. That was the wall, Clovis first. Nothing human came before it. Textbooks said it. Museums said it. Careers were built on it. And the Man I.S. rib didn't just break the wall, it broke it with the wrong weapon. Not a Clovis stone point, a bone point, something the entire field wasn't even looking for. Go back to 1977. A farmer named Emmanuel Manus, everyone called him Manny, was digging a pond on his property near Sequim, Washington. His backhoe hit something hard. Tusks. He had found a mastodon. Carl Gustafson, an archaeologist from Washington State University, came out to excavate. And in that waterlogged bog, where bone that should have rotted away had instead been preserved, he found the rib with something sticking out of it. Gustafson looked at it and said what he thought it was, a weapon. Evidence that people were hunting mastodons here around 14,000 years ago. The bog kept the bone. The tool outlived the hunter and the animal and eventually almost everyone who took Gustafson seriously. Because in 1977, he could not prove it. His dating methods were older. He had no way to look inside the bone. He could not rule out that the object was just a natural fragment jammed in by chance. So the field did what fields do with evidence that arrives too early. It shrugged. Maybe a bone spur. Maybe disturbed. Maybe wishful thinking from a man who wanted his sight to matter. For 30 years, Manus stayed a footnote, and Gustafson stayed the guy who overread a bone. Here's what I want you to understand. The objection was not stupid. That's the uncomfortable part. The layer had sealed the object. The date came from the bone itself. So if you wanted to keep Clovis first, you had exactly two moves. Call the point natural or call the date contaminated. And calling it natural was easier. Easier to say, easier to publish, easier on everyone's careers. The easiest way to bury a discovery is not to destroy it. It is to make the person holding it look careless. But one farm in Washington can be a fluke. One stubborn archaeologist can be wrong. The problem for the old model was that Manus was never alone. Thousands of miles south, a site had already started tearing the whole wall down. In southern Chile, an archaeologist named Tom Dillahay had been excavating a place called Monte Verde. And Monte Verde was a nightmare for Clovis first, because a peat bog had preserved things stone almost never leaves behind. Wood, hearths, worked plants, even what appeared to be a footprint pressed into ancient ground. The date came back around 14,500 years, older than Clovis, and this was at the bottom of two continents. For years, Monte Verde was attacked exactly the way Manus was. Too old, too messy. Must be wrong. So in 1997, something rare happened. A panel of senior archaeologists, including some skeptics, flew to Chile to see it for themselves. They walked to the site, they examined the evidence, and most of them agreed. Monte Verde was real. It was that old. That was the crack going public. But look at what it actually took. It didn't take one rib. It took a delegation of experts physically flying to the far end of South America before the field would admit the wall had a hole in it. Resistance wasn't the exception. Resistance was the default setting. And once Monte Verde held, every North American site that had been laughed off deserved a second look. Starting with a man who had been fighting since the 1970s and who paid for it longer than almost anyone. In Pennsylvania, James Adavasio had been excavating a rock shelter called Meadowcroft. Deep layers, careful digging, and dates that reached down past 16,000 years, maybe further. If that held, it wasn't just older than Clovis, it was dramatically older. The critics had a real objection, and this is where honesty matters. Meadowcroft sits in coal country. Groundwater moving through that ground can carry ancient carbon, and ancient carbon can make a radiocarbon date read older than the thing you're dating. That's a legitimate scientific concern. It's not gatekeeping to raise it. But here's the twist. A reasonable objection can also become a very convenient door, because as long as a contamination was possible, the old model never had to change. And Adovasio spent a career, decades, defending one site against the same recycled doubt. He wasn't just arguing for a date, he was arguing against the shape of his entire discipline. The field didn't need a villain, it had inertia. And inertia doesn't have to be cruel to end a career slowly. What the old model needed was evidence that contamination couldn't explain, something that couldn't have leached in through groundwater, something that had, at some point, been alive and human. And in the caves of Oregon, that's exactly what showed up. At Paisley Caves, an archaeologist named Dennis Jenkins was finding something most digs never recover: human coprolites, ancient human waste. Dried, preserved, and old, and inside them ancient human DNA. The dates ran back around 14,300 years. This wasn't a stone tool you could argue was natural. This was a person. Their biology, left in a cave. The critics adjusted. Fine, but DNA is mobile. It could have leached down from younger layers above. Water moves, molecules travel. So Jenkins and his team tested again, controlled the sediment, sampled repeatedly, checked the layers around the coprolites. Same answer. They tested it again. Same answer. That was the problem. Every time the field pushed, the cave pushed back with the same result. You can call one sample contamination. It gets harder when the cave keeps handing you the same date. But DNA is invisible. You cannot put it on a museum wall and make a general audience feel it. What the argument still needed was tools, real, worked stone, sealed underneath Clovis, where nothing was supposed to be. And a site in Texas delivered exactly that. Dug by the same scientist who would later put the Manus rib in a scanner. His name is Michael Waters. At a site called Buttermilk Creek, on Buttermilk Creek in central Texas, his team excavated thousands of stone artifacts, and they were stratified below the Clovis layer, dated to around 15,500 years. Think about what below means here, because it's the whole game. Clovis on top, older tools underneath, sealed. That's not something that fell down a crack. You cannot drop artifacts through solid, layered sediment and have them land in neat, older order. The floor held them in place like a locked drawer, and the drawer said someone was here first, and noticed the thread. The man scanning a Washington farmer's rib was the same man stacking tools under Clovis in Texas. This wasn't a scatter of unrelated oddities anymore. The same evidence was showing up in different states, in different forms, pointing at the same buried fact. So the question stopped being, did people beat Clovis? It became how? How did they get here this early, this spread out? And the answer sent researchers somewhere the old model never looked. Underwater. In Florida, in the dark water of the Osceola River, a team including Waters and an archaeologist named Jesse Halligan was diving on a site called Page Ladson. Down in the riverbed sediment, they recovered a mastodon tusk with what appeared to be cut marks and a stone knife. The date came back around 14,550 years. Sit with where that evidence was. Not in a desert, not in a cave, underwater. Because when the last ice age ended, the seas rose, and coastlines that people once walked went under. If the first Americans moved along the coast, then a huge amount of their story isn't hidden in an archive or a museum basement, it's drowned. Underwater, no critic can easily reach. This is a different kind of buried. Nobody had to cover it up. The ocean did it. Every one of these sites, on its own, gives a critic something to grab, a date to question, a layer to doubt. But then something appeared that you cannot call a natural bone spur, and you cannot call a leached molecule. Something anyone can look at and understand in 1 second. In New Mexico, at White Sands, researchers found footprints, human footprints, pressed into the mud of an ancient lakeshore and then sealed. And the dates that came back were not just older than Clovis. They landed somewhere around 21,000 to 23,000 years ago. That is not a small nudge to the timeline. That is a battering ram. And these are not abstract data points. There are small prints, children. There is a track that looks like someone carrying a child, setting it down, picking it up again. There are human footprints crossing the paths of giant ground sloths. This is a person standing on a specific patch of ground tens of thousands of years ago, in a place the model said was empty of humans. You cannot call a child's footprint contamination. The critics still had a real shot, and I'll give it to them straight. The original dates came from seeds of an aquatic plant, and aquatic plants can absorb old carbon from the water they grow in, which can push a radiocarbon date too far back. That reservoir effect is a genuine problem. For a while, it looked like it might sink the whole thing, so the team went back with different methods. They dated pollen from land plants with no water reservoir problem. They used optically stimulated luminescence, which measures the last time sediment grains saw sunlight, a completely independent clock. And the new results landed in the same ancient window. The objection that should have ended the argument got tested, and it weakened. That's the reversal. The date didn't collapse under scrutiny, the doubt did. And once the latter reaches 23,000 years, a terrifying question opens up. If it can go that far, where does it stop? Which brings us to the edge of the map, the claim most scientists refuse to touch. In San Diego, at a site called Cerruti, researchers reported broken mastodon bones and heavy stones they interpreted as tools. The claimed age? Around 130,000 years. Let me be completely clear, because this matters. That interpretation is overwhelmingly rejected. Most researchers think the bones were broken by heavy machinery during construction or by natural forces, not by people. This is not the answer. This is the fringe edge of the debate, and it deserves the skepticism it gets. But here's why it belongs in this story anyway. 20 years ago, the idea of humans in America, even 17,000 years ago, was treated as career suicide. Now footprints are pushing 23,000 and holding. The comfortable ceiling is gone. Cerruti almost certainly isn't real. But the fact that scientists now have to argue about it at all tells you how far the ground has shifted. When a wall falls, people start testing how far the field really extends. So forget the wildest date. The solid sites already did the real damage, not to the timeline alone, but to the route. And that's where the whole map stopped working. The old story needed that ice-free corridor, a gap between the great ice sheets that people walk through from Alaska southward. But study after study suggested that corridor wasn't actually open and livable early enough. There wasn't food, there wasn't passage. The road the textbooks drew may not have existed when these people were already here. So researchers like John Erlandson looked at the coast instead. The idea is sometimes called the Kelp Highway, a rich ribbon of coastline stretching down the Pacific, full of food that people could have followed by boat, staying fed the whole way. It's the strongest current explanation for how humans got south so fast, so early. And it's the reason the evidence is so hard to find, because that coastline is now underwater. Picture footprints already on the far side of a river before the bridge you're looking at was ever built. The bridge everyone kept studying, the corridor, appeared too late. The people were already across, which means they didn't use the bridge you can see. And then the DNA made it worse for the tidy version. Genetics now points to more than one founding lineage, not a single clean wave. There's a group called the Ancient Beringians, identified from remains at Upward Sun River in Alaska, that split off early. And stranger still, some indigenous populations deep in the Amazon carry a faint genetic signal that links, of all places, toward Australasia. Nobody has a confirmed explanation for how that signal got there. But it's real, it's published, and it does not fit one people, one wave, one road. The map didn't survive contact with the evidence. So here's how a model actually dies. Not in a press conference. Nobody stood up and said, "We were wrong for 50 years. Instead, the textbook softened. Museum labels got quieter. Clovis first slid, paragraph by paragraph, into the past tense. The retreat didn't come as an apology. It came as a revised caption. And this is the part that should bother you. Remember Carl Gustafson, the man laughed off for 30 years over a rib in a Washington bog? In 2011, Michael Waters and his team put that rib in a CT scanner. The scan resolved the shaped bone point buried inside. New radiocarbon dating locked it near 13,800 years. Gustafson was right. He'd been right the whole time, and he was still alive to see it. Here's the twist that makes it complicated instead of clean. The same institutions that dismissed him are also the reason the rib survived. It sat in a collection, protected, cataloged, for 3 decades until the technology arrived to prove what he'd said in 1977. The field was gatekeeper and archive at the same time. It buried the claim and preserved the evidence in the same building. Nobody told Gustafson he'd been treated unfairly. The field doesn't apologize. It adjusts. So what do we actually know? This part is solid. People were in the Americas well before Clovis, Manus, Monte Verde, Paisley, Buttermilk Creek, Page Ladson, real sites, real ages, and the footprints at White Sands are genuine human prints in genuinely ancient ground. Pre-Clovis is no longer the fringe, it's the baseline. This part is still fought over, the exact oldest dates, the full age of the White Sands prints. and precisely which route the first people took. And this part may never be settled. Cerruti's 130,000 years almost certainly isn't real. And the coastline that might hold the first chapter of this entire story, the beaches those earliest people actually walked, is under 100 meters of ocean. You can't excavate it. You can't dismiss it. You can't reach it. The point is still in the rib. It sits in a museum drawer in Washington, a shaped piece of bone driven into a mastodon by a hand almost 14,000 years ago, healed over by an animal that kept living a little longer. For 30 years it was a mistake. Then it was proof. And it was only ever the first crack. The old story wasn't a lie. It was just too small. And most of what would finish the argument is still out there in storage and sediment and underwater that hasn't given it back yet.